Okay, so let's look at Twitter. Are we live on Twitter?
Yes, we are.
Okay, what about on YouTube?
Hi, everybody. Please stand by.
So we are live on Twitter and on YouTube. We are also live on YouTube and on Instagram. Are we live on Instagram? We are not live on Instagram. Dimitri, I don't think I'll be able to make Instagram work for today. We should
Okay.
probably get going over here. So,
All right.
hello
Why don't we
everyone.
start?
Yeah. Welcome on this week's live stream for Reason to Resist. I think we came up with the name Week in Review, where our goal is to look at all these events that have happened this week in media and get some commentary. Sometimes we would bring some guests. I think the first week that we did the stream, 2 weeks ago, we had Laith Marouf. And this week I tried to find some guests to talk about the events that happened in Montreal for the NATO parliamentary session, but sadly that didn't work out. My name is Rami Yahya. I'm based in Montreal. I've been traveling the world a bit, the post-Soviet world, and documenting my journeys. And we have Dimitri. Do you want to? I mean, people know you more than me, but go for it. Can you want to introduce yourself?
Uh, I'm a lawyer and activist and journalist. Nowadays, the latter more than a lawyer. But I'm also based in Montreal with another base, sort of secondary home in Kalamata, Greece. And we have now, this is our third live stream. We are trying to do them regularly on Sunday evenings. We got a comment today from one of our audience members in the EU and asked us to begin these live streams when we're doing them from Canada earlier in the afternoon so that people can watch us late in the evening in the EU. And that's something Rami and I are likely going to do next week going forward. But we're going to continue to aim to do this Sunday during the afternoon or late afternoon East Coast time. In any event, thank you very much for joining us today. Such an incredible week in so many ways. Rami and I put our heads together and tried to find out tried to come to a decision as to what we should focus upon. Really earth-shattering events all around. Time moves by very quickly at this moment in human history. So with that, we did come up with an agenda that we'd like, and we're going to focus primarily on the situation in Ukraine. We're going to talk, because it is related to the situation in Ukraine, a little bit about the NATO summit, the Parliamentary Assembly for NATO happening in Montreal, actually just 2 blocks from where I am currently situated in downtown Montreal. And then, of course, we're going to talk about Palestine, Lebanon, and other parts of West Asia before we'd open it up to a Q&A. So with that, Rami, why don't you take charge and lead us through this discussion?
Yes, of course. And feel free to drop your comments. Occasionally, I'll be reading them. If there's anything interesting, sometimes I'll just share them on the screen as well. So to start on the agenda, well, first of all, Dimitri, this week we've published some pretty nice reports. An interview with Max Blumenthal and the Palestinian artist and Rehab Nazal. Any thoughts coming up about your discussion that you had with Max Blumenthal?
Well, Max and I were focused upon the issuance by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, of warrants for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and Hamas military leader Mohammed Daif. And we examined the Western government reaction to the issuance of these warrants. Also, we talked about the Israeli government reaction, which was entirely predictable. And we then talked about the fact that Netanyahu is confronting a host of legal troubles. Many people know about the corruption allegations that he's been dealing with for years and delaying the adjudication of for an eternity, it seems. But he has a new and arguably even more dangerous battle to wage in the legal sphere, and that is that an aide of his, we'll get into this in some detail, has been indicted for the grave crime of leaking state secrets. And it appears that Netanyahu knew what he was up to. So we'll get into that again some more. And finally, Max had, I guess when he first said it to me in the interview, I was a bit taken aback, but then it seemed perfectly logical to me. And he expressed the view that he thinks Netanyahu, for a variety of reasons, currently fears for his life. And you know, for one of those reasons is that Hezbollah actually managed to strike his villa on the coast of Israel with a drone recently, hitting his bedroom. But there are other reasons as well, which we got into. So I think it was quite an enlightening interview. Max is the editor of the Gray Zone. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of the issues that he reports upon. And it was an enlightening discussion for me personally. So I do recommend that you check out that interview if you haven't had a chance to do so. Rahab Nazal is a personal friend of mine, Palestinian Canadian artist. I have interviewed her several times since this genocide began in October of last year. She actually took me personally for a tour through the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, in March of this year when I went to Palestine. And in the interview we did this past week, we got the latest update from Rahab about the conditions in the West Bank where she's situated. And the long and the short of it is, for reasons she explained in the interview, she thinks what the Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank are experiencing now is far worse than anything they've ever experienced, including during either of the intifadas. So again, I urge you to check out that interview. Very enlightening and also very concerning.
Now, for the activities that have occurred this week, well, we spoke about this last week, just a few minutes before our stream last week, Dimitri. The United States announced that they gave permission to Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory using long-range missiles. And that same day, Russia has started revising its own usage of nuclear weapons policy. And more recently, we've seen that embassies across, the Canadian embassy, American embassy, as well as I believe a handful of European states decided to empty their embassies in Ukraine. And just moments after, I believe Russia started striking quite heavily using these ballistic missiles that are pretty much impossible to intercept and precisely hit their targets. Now, yeah. So what do you have to think about these? Have to say about these attacks and these use of long-range missiles?
I think we should go back first of all to September of this year, when Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, newly installed, went to Washington. If you could pull up image number 1,
Yes.
Rami. And you'll see, as the BBC reported in mid-September, Starmer, who had gone to Washington to get permission from the boss to give Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukrainians. Well, they already had them, but to authorize them to fire them into Russia at what they described as long-range targets. He, to the surprise of the British government, didn't get permission from the boss at the time. And as the BBC and other Western media outlets reported, essentially it all got fudged and the decision was put off indefinitely. And, a number of commentators at the time said that what appears to have happened is that because the Russian Federation president, upon hearing of the intention of the British government to authorize Ukraine to fire Storm Shadow missiles into Russia at targets that were relatively distant from the border, issued a very stern warning to the Americans about what this would mean, because apparently these missiles cannot be properly targeted without use of the American satellite system and classified information from the United States. So the reports at the time we received from independent commentators and analysts like Scott Ritter and Douglas McGregor and Lawrence Wilkerson were that the Pentagon expressed to Biden their profound concern with what Starmer was planning to do, and so Biden backed off. Then we fast forward. This, of course, was just before the election. Now we're in the post-election period, which the Democrats, in which they got thrashed. And effectively what Biden did, with really no explanation, is reversed course and authorized the Ukrainians not only to use long-range missiles, but to use American long-range missiles, what they're describing as long-range missiles, namely the ATACMS. So if you could pull up, Rami, the next image number 2.
Yeah.
I should mention, actually, before we get into the use of the ATACMS, on that day, as Rami mentioned at the outset, this was November 19th, as was reported by TASS, the President Vladimir Putin of Russia signed a decree approving a revised nuclear doctrine. Now, I just want to highlight a few things about this report from TASS, which I think you can easily confirm for yourself whether the report is accurate by looking at the revised nuclear doctrine, which is a publicly available document. And in the third paragraph of the TASS report, they say the fundamental principle of the doctrine is that the use of nuclear weapons is a measure of last resort to protect the country's sovereignty. The emergence of new military threats and risks prompted Russia to clarify the conditions for the use of nuclear weapons. In particular, the amended doctrine expands the range of countries and military alliances subject to nuclear deterrence, as well as the list of military threats that such deterrence is designed to counter. In addition, the document states that Russia will now view any attack by a non-nuclear country supported by a nuclear power as a joint attack. Moscow also reserves the right to consider a nuclear response to a conventional weapons attack threatening its sovereignty, a large-scale launch of enemy aircraft, missiles, and drones targeting Russian territory. So now let's go on to image 3, which is the Western media's report of the revised Russian nuclear doctrine. And it was somewhat different, to put it mildly. And this would be image 3.
Yeah.
So you'll see that the Associated Press reported that Putin had lowered the threshold for using his nuclear arsenal after Biden's arms decision for Ukraine. I think that that's a highly debatable interpretation of the revised nuclear doctrine, to put it mildly, because the argument of Associated Press is that the revised nuclear doctrine allows Russia to use nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack. Well, I think that was at least implicit in the prior nuclear doctrine. What Russia said, it never said in the prior nuclear doctrine that it would only use nuclear weapons in response to the use of nuclear weapons. I don't believe that was the official position of the Russian Federation. The official position was that if they are attacked in a way that represents, in essence, an existential threat to the state, and you can be threatened existentially when you're going up against the NATO alliance with conventional weapons. They have conventional weapons, as we're seeing in Gaza, which can cause immense destruction to civilian infrastructure. Then that could pose a severe threat to the survival of the state. So I think it was at least implicit in the prior nuclear doctrine that Russia might use, it reserved the right to use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances in response to a conventional weapons attack. So I don't think that they lowered the threshold at all. To me, what really stands out about this doctrine, and other commentators have mentioned it, the revised doctrine, is that the Russian Federation said very clearly, I think this is the first time they've said this, if you are a part of a military alliance, one of whose members attacks us in a way that we feel is threatening, even though you yourself did not directly participate in the attack, we consider you to be fair game. So if, for example, Ukraine uses American or British missiles in a way that are considered to be a severe threat to the Russian Federation, Russia reserves the right to strike any member of NATO, even Greece, even if it didn't have anything to do with uh, the attack in question, because these states, according to the theory of the Russian Federation, are all cooperating and assisting each other directly or indirectly in launching these attacks, even though they might not participate directly in some specific attack. So in any event, that was the effect. And so on this very day when they adopt this revised nuclear posture, uh, the Ukrainians launch an attack on a target in Bryansk. Could you put up image number 4, Rami?
Yes. Image number 4. And Dimitri, I would even go to say that the Americans are actually encouraging Ukraine to strike deep. So that level of complicity is quite self-explanatory.
Right, it's quite obvious. So here you see National Public Radio describing, summarizing the attack. The U.S. did confirm it happened. They fired 6 ATACMS missiles into Russia for the first time, and they were apparently targeting, it looks like some kind of headquarters or operations base for the Northern Army of the Russian Federation in the region of Bryansk, city north of Ukraine. And this, of course, I think and they used 6 ATACMS missiles, so they clearly wanted to hit the target. This was not simply a symbolic strike or attempt to strike the target. And I've seen reports, I saw a very interesting interview yesterday from Dmitry Orlov, who says that apparently none of these ATACMS struck the target. 5 of the 6 were struck or destroyed in flight by Russia's air defense system. The 6th was damaged. It did land in some damaged form on some infrastructure, did cause some damage, but it didn't actually hit the target. So none of them apparently hit the target. And these things apparently cost something like $2 million or $3 million a piece. A question for U.S. taxpayers is, why are we wasting our money on missiles that are not actually effective at hitting their target? But by far the most important concern, of course, is how the Russian Federation will respond to this. And they did respond. They responded by bringing out a new weapon, a new missile that we have not seen before. And this happened, I believe it was on the 22nd. Could you please pull up video number 5, and let's share with our audience what happened here. So this is a target. This is actually reported to be a missile production factory in the Ukrainian city, or outside the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. Watch again. I believe we're about to see it from another angle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so if we just stop there, Rami, what you just saw there, and I've watched and listened to some very interesting analysis by Theodore Postel, who's a weapons expert at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's gone on to several programs and talked about it. And his analysis, it's not by any means a certainty because he has limited information available to him, doesn't have a hotline to the Kremlin, is that this is a hypersonic missile. Apparently it has a range, it flew approximately 2,000 kilometers. It was described by Vladimir Putin as a medium range ballistic missile. Apparently medium range means it has a range of 1,000 to 3,000 kilometers. And the missile in question, according to Theodore Postel, skims along the upper atmosphere horizontally for some period of time, which allows it to increase its range. And then as it approaches its target, this particular missile had 6 warheads in them. And that's why you saw 6 separate flashes of light coming down from the sky. And in each of the warheads is 6 separate missiles. So there's a total of 36 missiles inside this particular missile. And they are nuclear capable. So these were conventional weapons. There's been some speculation about whether there was even a conventional warhead on these missiles, because when you watch the missile strike the target, it doesn't seem like from the distance we're watching it, there's an explosion. But that doesn't mean they can't do damage. Even if they didn't have a conventional warhead on them, the kinetic energy from these hypersonic missiles is so great that they can do immense damage even without a conventional warhead. In any event, you can imagine the destruction that this weapon can inflict with 36 separate missiles. Apparently, they are all independently maneuverable. They're not only so fast that they cannot be brought down by any air defense system that the West currently has. The West doesn't have hypersonic missile capability, but in addition, they basically saturate a target and with maneuverable warheads. So the point that Vladimir Putin sought to make, and he did so explicitly, is this weapon is unstoppable, and its range is such that we could strike any target in Europe. I repeat, any target in Europe with this weapon, and there is nothing that you could do about it. Now, the reaction, to the extent there's been one at all, a discernible reaction, is a lot of silence. There's still a lot of, chest pumping going on. I saw, for example, some U.S. general by the name of Keane went on Fox News and was, spewing bravado. But the Biden administration itself does not seem anxious to comment specifically at this time on the significance of this particular weapon. And what is most notable, I think, is that NATO has convened an emergency meeting with the Ukrainian President Zelensky to happen this Tuesday, November 26th, on the day after the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, now going on in Montreal, a couple of blocks from where I am, has been concluded. The plenary session of that assembly happens on Monday, November 25th. So the next day, they're having an emergency meeting with Ukraine. And the question, of course, is what are they going to do now? A lot of people are looking at this as a final warning by Russia. If they do it again, if they use either ATACMS or Storm Shadows to strike, sensitive targets inside Russia, I think at that stage, there is a high likelihood that the Russian Federation will strike a Western military target. I want to be very clear about that. We're not talking about some military personnel or military assets inside Ukraine. We are talking about a strike on a military target belonging to a Western nation, could be any Western nation outside of Ukraine. It could be, for example, Britain's military base in Akrotiri, Greece, which I've reported on extensively, which is funneling huge amounts of weapons to Israel as it's committing a genocide. It could be US or British or French naval vessels in international waters. It could be a NATO military base in Poland or Romania. And I think it's quite clear that what the Russian Federation is envisioning is not that there will be a nuclear strike, but that it will use one of these conventional missiles or perhaps another of its numerous hypersonic conventional missiles to inflict severe damage on a Western military target. And of course, the existential question that will then arise is, how will the West respond to that? So we are in a very, very dangerous place. I cannot stress that enough. Rami, what are your thoughts about all of this?
Dimitri, I remember when the war in Ukraine just started, and people were talking about how Russia has lost control. They were supposed to win the war in under 48 hours, and they weren't able to do so. It just shows the weakness of the Russian army. And then Russia was at the gates of Kiev with maybe 50 kilometers of tanks lined up outside of Kiev. And then people were saying Russia withdrew because it wasn't able to conquer Kiev, or was not able to show enough force to make to scare away the Ukrainian regime. What I understand from these hypersonic ballistic missiles that were that were shot by Russia, is that Russia has not lost any control or composure in this war, and actually, if anything, it's the West that doesn't know what to do and is just trying to escalate with no real goal in sight. There's a clear correlation and causation between the acts that Russia are committing or doing and the escalation that Ukraine is trying to do. So, I mean, at this point, these missiles that Russia is showing us right now, they could have been thrown long ago during the war, and they're doing it to show that this war could end if there's a negotiation, and we need to push Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. Now, beyond this, Dimitri, I was just going through the news earlier today. In Halifax, there's a security forum happening. And even the leaders of Taiwan now are not pushing Ukraine to negotiate. They're actually pushing the world to stop sending weapons to Taiwan and instead flood Ukraine with more weapons. So this just shows that we're completely delusional on our side of the world, thinking that more weapons is going to bring us any form of peace or settlement in this region. But thankfully, Dimitri, just before going live on this call, we started looking at the elections going on in Romania. Now, we were not going to claim to know so much about the Romanian elections, but we're seeing a tendency here where in some way an independent outsider ended up finishing first in the first round of elections. A man named Calin Georgescu, who shocked the establishment, coming in with 22 point some change percentage of the vote, cementing himself as number one in the first round of the elections of the polls. And his platform revolves around kind of finding independence for Romania, a true form of independence, an independence away from these globalized institutions such as NATO. He's seen as a staunch opponent of NATO and sending more weapons to Ukraine. And then similarly, right now the vote count is still happening, but the person that is either third or fourth, his name is George Simeon, currently at around 13 or 14%, is also looking to send less weapons to Ukraine. So we're seeing that there's gradual change happening in Europe, people coming into sense that we're never going to be able to beat Russia, at least not with this type of warfare that we're seeing, and that we should probably spend more time to de-escalate and to find a peaceful settlement that will take into account, the concerns of these regional players. So that's pretty much what I have to say about this. But yeah.
I just want to just share with our audience a little bit of, I'd never heard of Georgescu until today when Rami brought his stunning success in the first round of the Romanian election to my attention. And I saw immediately when I quickly checked before our live stream began tonight, Western media reports about him, that they're describing him as an ultra-nationalist and far right. I'm not in a position, Rami, maybe you could comment on this, to deny that that's correct, but I do note that his Wikipedia entry, and Wikipedia is hardly pro-Russian, says that Georgescu was the executive director of the United Nations Global Sustainable Index in Geneva, that he was the president of the European Research Center for the Club of Rome from 2013 to 2015, and he was a special rapporteur in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2010 to 2012. That doesn't sound like somebody who's far right to me, but again, I don't, other than what I've read in these media reports in the last hour and on Wikipedia, I don't know anything about him. Rami, do you know anything about him? Why do you think they're calling him far right?
Well, I mean, Dimitri, there's a track record, whether it is in Canadian politics, any Western electoral system, where anyone's slightly critical of the war in Ukraine, of our own complicity in war crimes around the world, we're immediately, labeled as pro-Russian or I mean, collaborators of any sort of any regime that fits against the narrative. Mm-hmm. So this word is often thrown loosely, which is quite ironic because, as much as we would need to look into any form of evidence. And I would not discount the fact that he might or may not be a neo-Nazi collaborator. But the thing is that we are actively sending weapons to neo-Nazis in Azov, in Ukraine, and that doesn't seem to be any form of bring any sort of concern to Western governments. And the Canadian government has a list of 900 people that we refuse to make their names public, who have direct ties or historic ties to the Nazis. So
who came into Canada from I believe Ukraine after the Second World War. So
exactly.
900 suspected Nazis, probably the vast majority of whom are dead. The Canadian government refuses to disclose their names. Of course, Rami, there was the double standing ovation for a living Ukrainian Nazi in the Canadian Parliament last year.
Zelensky.
There were the repeated votes of the Trudeau government against a UN General Assembly resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. And the one thing which we're going to be talking about in greater detail is every Western government, to a large degree, in some cases completely 100%, is supporting an extreme right-wing Israeli regime that is committing genocide before the eyes of the world. So when these establishment politicians in the West point the finger at their political opponents and call them right-wing, that sounds to me like the pot calling the kettle black. But hey, what do I know? So Rami, anything else you want to add about this before we move on to the statement of Vladimir Putin?
No, but Dimitri, I think we should definitely pay a bit more attention to the next the second round of the elections, since this will be extremely important for development in the Ukraine war, considering Romania has quite a significant border with Ukraine.
So just to conclude on the subject of the extraordinarily dangerous situation in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, we would like to share with you a clip from an emergency address to the Russian people that Vladimir Putin delivered hours after this awesome display of conventional military force, as a response to the ATACMS being used on Bryansk. So could you pull up, please, Rami, the video number 6? And I'm going to read, he's speaking Russian, of course. I'm going to read the...
В ответ на применение американского и британского дальнобойного оружия 21 ноября текущего года российские вооруженные силы нанесли комбинированный удар по одному из объектов оборонно-промышленного комплекса Украины. В боевых условиях было проведено в том числе и испытание одной из новейших российских ракетных систем средней дальности. В данном случае с баллистической ракетой с безъядерным гиперзвуковым освещением. Мы считаем себя вправе применять наше оружие против военных объектов тех стран, которые позволяют применять свое оружие против наших. А в случае эскалации агрессивных действий будем отвечать также решительно и зеркально. Об этом рекомендую серьезно задуматься и правящим элитам тех стран, которые вынашивают планы использовать против России свои воинские контингенты.
That sounds to me like the Russian government has had enough. Just to give you a sense, everybody, of how dangerous the situation currently is, we also wanted to share with you a video which the European Union or European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen put out in the last couple of days, addressing herself to the Ukrainian people. If this doesn't concern you, I think you may want to revisit your views about the level of danger that we now confront.
Video 8.
This would be video 8, yes.
1,000 days ago, Russia tried to wipe Ukraine off the map. And for 1,000 days, Russia has failed because of Ukraine's resistance and the sacrifice of your heroes. Today is a day of mourning, but also a day of promise. We promise to keep standing by your side for as long as it takes. You can rest assured that European and Western support will continue to flow. The winter ahead may be scary, but it is in stormy days that true friends show up. And Europe is your true friend. Your freedom is our freedom, and our union is your home. Long live Europe and Slava Ukraini.
In the interest of time, Rami, you and I talked about breaking that video down sentence by sentence, but we're running a little bit behind schedule. So I'm just going to say this. Virtually every sentence that came out of Ursula von der Leyen's mouth was a lie. I don't think there's any realistic prospect of Ukraine being admitted to the European Union within our lifetimes. The country is now devastated, and its admission to the European Union would cause immense difficulty for the existing states in Europe who are already in a world of pain for a variety of reasons, including their sanctions on the Russian Federation, which have backfired terribly on their economies. They don't care about the Ukrainian people. They will not stand by the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes. They are using the Ukrainian people to enrich the military-industrial complex in the West, but above all, to weaken and potentially dismember Russia, which was always their plan. I think their own statements substantiate that abundantly. And frankly, what should alarm us the most is that that statement does not evince the slightest bit of humility, the slightest bit of restraint, the slightest bit of acknowledgement that the West bears any responsibility whatsoever for this existentially dangerous war. And I myself, Rami, I don't know if these people understand anything other than escalation. I've seen no indication whatsoever that the demonstration of that new capability in Dnipro by the Russian Federation has caused these people to get religion. So again, I don't want to just, cause people to feel alarm with no sort of suggestion for how we deal with the situation. I think what we should be doing is putting maximum pressure on our elected officials. Call them, go see them, email them, take part in protests. We need to become very vociferous about pressuring our governments into bringing an end to the Ukraine proxy war as quickly as possible.
Dimitri, there's a comment in the chat from a gentleman named Rami who said they never cared. And I think there's nothing more true than this. I mean, we saw the Nord Stream pipelines getting bombed by the United States and Ukraine. And the Germans really have never been more loyal to the United States till this day, to this moment. So I really don't know what to say. I think our governments in the West are bought out. There's a lack of true self-determination and autonomy for our countries. And you called Canada and other Western states vassals for so long. And I think at this point, it just becomes more and more visible. Now, what I'm more shocked, Dimitri, is the lack of action taken by people living in the West. I would expect a lot more resistance. I think we're going to briefly talk about what happened with the NATO parliamentary session protests in Montreal, I believe on Friday. And I mean, this is what I kind of expect everywhere else to happen in the world. While we're seeing the change happening in Romania with the elections going on, there is a silent majority of people that I think that are opposing. I could think that there's a form of neoliberal chain that is tying our populations or taming us to the point where the increase in cost of living is pushing us to have 2 or 3 more jobs rather than to uprise. But I think the best investment that we could have as people living in the West is to really bring back autonomy to our people and to have control over the fate of our government and our foreign policy. But yeah, should we transit?
Yeah, sure. And in terms of, I think the most the main reason why we haven't seen a public response that's commensurate with the danger we confront is because of the corporate media. Yeah. Like right now, I just quickly opened up, went to the homepage of the New York Times. I don't see a single article anywhere, just looking at the headlines, about the risk of nuclear war. I was checking out the major Canadian newspapers today. I went to their homepages, and again, there's utter silence about this. This is journalistic negligence and malpractice of the worst kind, and it's putting the public into a false sense of security and complacency. Now, fortunately, at the NATO Parliamentary Summit, there was a sizable protest, which had a lot to do. It wasn't strictly about the situation that's spiraling out of control in Eastern Europe, it was also, of course, about the genocide in Gaza. Some 1,500 protesters went to the Palais de Congrès, which, as I said, is just a hop, skip, and a jump from where I am right now, and were met with hordes of Montreal riot police. This was on Friday of this week. I happened to be in Toronto on Thursday night to deliver a speech on the Ukraine war and the genocide in Gaza. And my train arrived just minutes after this protest concluded. And I had to walk by the Palais de Congrès to get to my house from the train station in Montreal. And what I saw a whole bunch of riot police, but I didn't see any damage. I didn't see any violence. And then when I got home later that evening, I saw this cascade of reports from people who are pro-Israel, not just inside Canada, but many of them outside Canada, the United States and Europe, claiming that pro-Hamas terror mobs had taken over the center of Montreal. Can you pull up image 9?
I believe it's on the screen, Dimitri.
I'm sorry?
It's on the screen.
Oh, it's on the screen. Thank you. Let me just point out something about this image. These are actually 2 posts on X that were reposted by a character by the name of Greg Brady. Now, the first post, you'll see there at the top, his name is Marco Mendicino. He is a minister in the Trudeau government, so he's a liberal. And look how he describes this. Madness as violent anti-Israel protesters stormed the streets. Objects including small explosive devices were hurled at police, stores smashed, and vehicles set on fire. Enough, find them, arrest them, charge them, restore order, stop the madness. Marco Mendicino, since we're on the subject of madness, is one of the most pro-Israel, pro-genocide, anti-Palestinian racist scoundrels in the Canadian political elite. For this man to be lecturing other people on madness is the height of hypocrisy. And then this character again, Greg Brady, I'll come back and tell you about him in a second. He reposted another post by Melissa Lantsman, who's a conservative. So she's a senior member of the official opposition. I think she's actually the deputy leader of the Conservative Party, if I'm not mistaken. Lantsman, too, is one of the most outspoken, aggressive, and extreme supporters of Israel. She says in her post, complete lawlessness in Montreal as the pro-Hamas terror mobs emboldened by the Trudeau Liberals destroy the PM's own hometown. Rioters on a violent rampage and not a single word from our government. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that I just showed you a post from a minister in the Liberal government. So the idea that the Liberal government was not condemning the supposed violence on the part of the protesters is preposterous. Of course, they were being just as extreme in their commentary as Melissa Lantsman was. But anyways, who's this guy, Greg Brady? Greg Brady is the host of a talk show on a major radio network in Toronto. Greg Brady, in January of this year, actually invited me onto his talk show to debate a lunatic Zionist from the legal profession by the name of Howard Levitt. Mr. Levitt, about the genocide in Gaza, Mr. Levitt, I'll say, I'll try to be restrained here, didn't fare particularly well in our debate. So Greg Brady invited me back onto the program 2 weeks later to debate another Zionist who was the public relations director or the spokesperson for Conservative Premier Doug Ford of Ontario, who also is a fanatical Zionist. And she too, I think it's fair to say, didn't perform particularly well in our debate, in large part because she didn't know what she was talking about. She was just reading from a script that I think somebody had given her. In any event, I wasn't invited back onto the program after that. But this guy, Greg Brady, the fact that he's spreading this nonsense should be a concern because he has a sizable audience in Toronto. And of course, people in Toronto, they're not going to know one way or another what really happened because they live in Toronto, whereas I live in Montreal and saw with my own eyes that these were grotesque exaggerations. So I just want to conclude on this point by reading from a press release that was put out just about an hour or two ago by a peace group in Montreal, which sets the record straight. So if you just bear with me for a second.
And Dimitri, just while you pull this up, the police, well, the head of police in the city of Montreal himself downplayed the protest, saying it was not that bad. It was not that big of a scale as you guys claim to say. So they were talking about about dozens of police officers injured. The head of the police said there's only one, and he's barely injured. So it was greatly.
So this statement was put out, as I say, a couple hours ago by the Divest for Palestine Collective. And in it, they denounce the police violence and NATO complicity in the colonial genocide in Palestine. They go on to say specifically about the protest that happened at Friday night the following, I'm quoting, "The collective also strongly condemns the police violence on the crowd demonstrating against the complicity of NATO members in imperialist wars and the colonial genocide of the Palestinian people. The Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, SPVM, made excessive use of tear gas and beat demonstrators with truncheons and shields during dangerous dispersal maneuvers. At least 4 people had to be rushed to hospital by ambulance. One of the injured suffered serious injuries as a result of being clubbed over the head. While waiting for the ambulance, the injured person was assisted by first aiders who were violently assaulted by the SPVM. Among those hospitalized, a photographer was injured after being hit in the eye by a projectile thrown by the police and then pepper sprayed. Another person suffered a fractured arm following blows from a truncheon, not to mention the discomfort suffered by several demonstrators following dangerous overexposure to chemical irritants." So it is true that some windows were broken, apparently by some of the protesters, and that some cars were damaged. But I'm not aware of any evidence whatsoever that any of the protesters actually injured anybody or caused serious damage to civilian infrastructure. I don't condone, breaking windows or smashing cars, but the narrative that we're hearing is, of course, grotesquely one-sided, and it's entirely possible, based upon the evidence that we have, that it was the police who initiated the violence and who caused things to spiral out of control.
Now, Dimitri, just before you introduced this subject, you said that there was a great distrust with media. And I opened TVA Nouvelles, which is, maybe it's my fault for consulting that media source, since it's probably one of the worst ones out there. But when I opened TVA, there was an article about the protests going on. And they interviewed Anissa Kimball, a teacher at Université Laval in Quebec City. And she said this protest is completely misguided because one of the claims of the protesters is that NATO is a strong ally of Israel, and that is absolutely false. So she's saying that these people, those protesters, are unaware, and they're protesting something that they don't know anything about. Now, this is a teacher at Université Laval, a professor, probably has a PhD, and she says that there's no such thing or any form of or correlation or association between NATO and the genocide happening in Palestine. As much as she likes to, she's losing hope in young people for protesting, I lost complete hope in this form of academia that is completely lost, and that, either is believing in her own lies, but Dimitri, what form of complicity do you attribute to NATO for the genocide happening in Palestine?
Well, NATO, as Tamara Lorenz, peace activist who joined me on this speaking tour, explained, NATO is tied at the hip to Israel. Israel is essentially a de facto member of NATO, and NATO, all the major NATO military forces, the Brits, the Germans, the French, the Americans, are the means by which the genocide is being carried out. They provide the weapons, the intelligence. The British themselves, as Declassified UK has reported, they're conducting spy flights over Gaza. They're giving real-time intelligence to the Israelis, which they're using in ways that are criminal, clearly criminal. So NATO is deeply complicit in the genocide in Gaza, and without the participation and support of major NATO members, it wouldn't happen. It's as simple as that.
Now, Dimitri, later on in the article, the Université de Laval professor ends up discrediting the protesters as falling for Russian propaganda. That's just, it's a recurring pattern here of just discrediting things as just Russian propaganda and nothing has anything to do with NATO, and NATO is this great, peaceful, loving association that is just there to come to our defense. And just something, just because it's happening in Montreal, and I have quite a lot of friends here in Montreal, and it's in my timeline. One thing that I saw a beautiful comment of a former coworker of mine who mentioned that, I'm just going to paraphrase a bit, but he said that when the government is abandoning its own population, right, the people in Montreal are proudly in support of Palestine and don't want to be complicit in the genocide of Palestine, this is how these types of things end up happening. People will take justice into their own hands because there's no justice that can be found anywhere. So at the end of the day, I do not like to see my city up in fire and these, whatever the media is trying to say, broken windows everywhere. But truly, where does the responsibility lie? Is it in the hands of people that are powerless in front of a genocide and that want to do anything in their capability to end it? Or is it the people that are, siding with the genocide, directly having blood on their hands of the Palestinian people? Yeah. So at the end of the day, people need to hold our governments accountable. And if protesting this way is not the best way to do so, then what is it?
Right. I'm surprised, frankly, Rami, given what we've witnessed, the horrors we've witnessed over the last year and the complete indifference of our governments to the demands of people of conscience. I'm surprised there hasn't been more violence. The level of restraint that pro-Palestinian protesters have shown is, I think, on the whole, extraordinarily impressive. I walked, as I mentioned, around the entire Palais de Congrès immediately after this protest was dispersed. And I saw virtually no damage. I saw a few broken windows, a few damaged cars. It's not as though, downtown Montreal was left in smoking ruins. It was really minimal damage. And like everything the Zionists do, they are grotesquely, hyperbolically, hyperventilating about incidents that really are, in the grand scheme of things, inconsequential when you compare them to the violence of Israel and Western states. So with that, why don't we move on to the ICC warrants, Rami? And of course, we don't need to get into the basic details of this because just about everybody watching will know by now that the International Criminal Court finally issued warrants for the arrest of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the defense minister whom he recently fired from that position, Yoav Gallant, also for Mohammed Daif, a military leader of Hamas. The prosecutor of the ICC initially sought arrest warrants for 3 Hamas officials. One of them was Yahya Sinwar, and another one, I believe, was Ismail Haniyeh. Both of them have been killed by the Israelis. It appears that Mohammed Daif is still alive, although there's some uncertainty about that. So if they were still alive, there probably would have been issued 3 arrest warrants for the Palestinians who are being destroyed by a genocidal regime, and only 2 for Israeli leaders. Not even Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have been indicted by the ICC prosecutor, the 2 most extreme members of the Israeli cabinet who have openly incited genocide. So we want to talk about the reaction to this. Let's go to image 10, Rami. And you'll see there, everybody, that this was Blinken's reaction. Antony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, mercifully will soon be out of a job. He immediately said he wants to work with Congress to penalize the International Criminal Court. If that isn't the essence of a rogue state, I don't know what is. Now, to be fair to him, the U.S. isn't a party to the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, but they were very happy, the Biden administration, when this same institution, the ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. I believe that was last year, for removing children from a war zone. Not for trying to exterminate people, which is what the ICC alleges with complete justification Netanyahu and Gallant have been doing, but for removing children from a war zone. And in my interview with Max Blumenthal, he talked at great length about this indictment against Vladimir Putin because they did an investigation. And so if you want to learn more about the thin gruel that indictment actually constitutes, you should listen to that interview, which you'll find on our YouTube channel. Now, I just want to say one thing about Blinken before we move on to other reactions. Of course, Blinken is going to say this at the end of the day, because if in fact the indictment is well-founded, that could lead to severe criminal liability for Blinken himself. Blinken has been the primary reason why the Israelis have been able to sustain this genocidal rampage for so long. He is, as other observers have commented, effectively Netanyahu's lawyer. He has whitewashed Israel's crimes. He has done everything in his power to ensure that Israel has the weapons to carry out those crimes. So of course he's going to be alarmed by the indictment of Netanyahu and Gallant, because the obvious implication is that he himself is a war criminal. So can we move on then to the Starmer report? And just by way of background, of course, all kinds of Western leaders were asked what they were going to do in response to the issuance of these arrest warrants. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, said that, and I've highlighted at the bottom of the image the words of his official spokesperson, said the government respected the independence of the court. But the very next sentence in that report, he declined to say whether Mr. Netanyahu would be arrested if he arrived in the UK. So now can we pull up the Trudeau image? Here's what Justin Trudeau had to say. Trudeau said, and I saw the press conference, you can easily find a video of it, that Canada will abide by the international rulings and regulations of international judicial institutions. And then he went on to say, it's just who we are as Canadians, which, flies in the face of Canada's complete and utter indifference and contempt for the prior decisions of the ICJ. There are now 3 or 4 of them relating to Israel, not to mention countless resolutions of the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly, calling, for example, on Israel to stop its settlements, calling on Israel to respect the Palestinian right of self-determination, the right of return. The Canadian government has totally disregarded all of those international legal instruments and decisions. So it's not who we are as Canadians, at least not who the Canadian government is. Now, I'm not going to show it to you in the interest of time, but similar statements were made by the EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, when he was asked about the arrest warrants. He said, oh yes, we're going to respect the decision of the ICJ or the ICC. But again, there was no explicit commitment to arresting Netanyahu or Gallant if they set foot on European soil. I myself am highly doubtful that they will do that. I mean, if they're not willing to stop sending weapons to Israel after the ICJ has ruled, with every Western judge concurring that it's plausible Israel is committing genocide, are we seriously to believe that these characters are going to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant if they step foot on their soil? Rami, what do you think?
I mean, this is clearly comical. And then I think there's this whole thing about international law and rules-based order. And I have a couple of screenshots that I want to show about this. But Dimitri, you've mentioned something. They killed Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar. And technically they cannot be guilty of crimes against humanity or whatever accusations held against them because they were killed before their trial. Now, the first thing the Israelis said when the warrants were published is that we're equating terrorism with Israel. And that's where the Hail Mary comes in. At the last minute, they put in an arrest warrant for Mohammed Deif. It's for Israel to come up with these claims of false equivalency. And Bernard-Henri Lévy, who's this, I don't even know what to call him, a French politician or
Henri Lévy.
Yeah.
He's described by the French establishment as a philosopher.
Okay, well, whatever floats his boat.
He's extreme in his Zionism.
So this is him, 17th of March, 2023. Great news. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for the deportation of Ukrainian children. The truth is glaring. Justice will prevail. And then just a few days ago, okay, Bernard-Henri Lévy, this strong pioneer of international law, of course, ends up saying, The International Criminal Court distorts international law. It disfigures the noble idea of international justice invented in the 20th century to prosecute criminals in countries without proper judicial systems. For this reason, the ICC must be abolished and replaced. Okay, so all it took was less than a year or so to get this man to go from promoting the good work of the International Criminal Court to calling for the dismantlement and destruction of it. This is the difference between international law and the rules-based order. Bernard-Henri Lévy, is the litmus of what passes and fails in the rules-based order of the Americans.
And I wouldn't put him past them, Rami, too. I think that Western governments are now going to do everything in their power to destroy the ICC. Not because they care. They do, of course, want Israel to complete its genocidal project. In my opinion, that's exactly what they want. But I think, as I mentioned at the outset when we talked about Blinken, what they're most concerned about is that they're next. A precedent has been established. A leader of a Western country or a country allied with the West has been charged with serious crimes against humanity by the ICC. And that opens up a world of negative possibilities for the leadership of Western governments, particularly the United States and Britain, which have committed so many war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's why, more than anything else, they're going ballistic over the issuance of these warrants. So I think we can expect to see in the days, weeks, and months ahead a concerted effort, collective concerted effort by Western governments to destroy the International Criminal Court. Now, moving on with the subject of the arrest warrants, I just want to say that this is not the only, legal entanglement that Benjamin Netanyahu now confronts. Of course, we all know about the corruption charges that have been outstanding against him for an eternity, and he and his allies have done an extraordinary job of delaying Judgment Day in those various corruption cases that have been filed against him, criminal proceedings. But also, an aide to Netanyahu was just indicted with serious allegations. Could you please pull up the image relating to Eli Feldstein?
Yes.
So this character, Feldstein, was a spokesman, an aide to Netanyahu. He was indicted on Thursday of this week by the state prosecution on what is described by the Times of Israel as a grave charge of harming state security as part of the security document scandal. Basically, as I understand it, there is compelling evidence that Feldstein provided to Western media. I think it was Bild, German tabloid, which is, again, extremely pro-Israel, documents which made certain fabricated claims about, Sinwar wanting to take the hostages into Egypt, and apparently the purpose of this, classified information being provided to the Western media was to justify Netanyahu's refusal to do a hostage deal. The argument seems to have been they were making was, well, they're going to take the hostages out of Gaza and hide them somewhere in the Sinai. So any deal that we do ultimately will not be complied with. So we may as well continue to prosecute the war. That essentially is, I think, the theory of the prosecutors. Now, this article doesn't say this, but there have been subsequent reports in the Israeli media where it seems quite clear that Netanyahu knew all about this. He was fully aware. So if they are going to prosecute this man, Eli Feldstein, with the grave charge of harming state security, I think it's just a matter of days, perhaps even hours, before Netanyahu himself is charged with these offenses. So he has now the ICC arrest warrants. He has the potential to be indicted in connection with the state secret scandal. And he, of course, has his corruption charges, which are ongoing. And in fact, he's expected or required to give testimony shortly in one of those corruption cases, testimony in a court of law. So can we go on then to another we're going to move off the subject of the legal jeopardy confronting Netanyahu and talk about another scandal that is embroiling the Israeli military.
Dimitri, just before we do this, I wanted to take a time and speak about what's going on in Khiam in Lebanon, South Lebanon. Khiam is a village city 6 kilometers away from the border with the Zionist entity from Israel. And this city is quite strategic because Israel is fighting extremely hard to try to capture this city, since Israel sees the strategic value in launching future invasions of Lebanon through Khiam. So it wants to get that control of Khiam. And Khiam is around another 6 kilometers away from Mar Shayun, which was the capital of the South Lebanese, of the Free State of South Lebanon, which was an entity that was created after Israel occupied south of Lebanon after the war of 1982. And in 1985, Israel ended up opening a prison in Khiam called the Khiam Detention Center, where grave cases of human rights abuses were held there. So Khiam is a city of around 95% of the population there are Shiites, and the South Lebanese army, which was a proxy army that Israel created to push its occupation of South Lebanon, ended up using this prison to torture and get confessions out of Muslim Lebanese men in the city of Khiam. And when Hezbollah liberated south of Lebanon, Robert Fisk ended up going to the Khiam Detention Center and discovered large torture chambers, which were basically hosting electric cables that were used on genitals of the prisoners to get these confessions. And this was a long list of different forms of abuses that were committed in the prison, which is consistent with the types of abuses that Israel committed in Burj al-Baraj and refugee camp in Beirut, or Sabra Shatila, and even what we're seeing right now with the case of the Palestinian prisoners getting killed in the prisons in Israel, and the abuses and cases of sexual assault that we're witnessing there. But the Lebanese resistance has been defending Khiam quite well, and it's seen as a case of a huge military failure for Israel. Hezbollah is describing hundreds of casualties in Khiam alone, and Khiam seems to be going to be remembered in the future a bit the same way how Marun al-Ras and Bint Jbel are basically bastions of cases of victory that Hezbollah were able to get after the war of 2006. So the front line in the south of Lebanon is not moving at all for Israel. After almost 2 months, they cannot get 6 kilometers away from the border with Palestine, with Israel, with the Zionist entity. So it's quite. And now we're talking about. I think we're going to talk about this maybe later on. But the United States are pushing for a ceasefire in order to isolate the case of Gaza with the other forms of resistance happening throughout the region. But all I could understand now, and I think this goes hand in hand with what we're going to be talking about, how Israel is sending these, you call them amateur historians, to south of Lebanon to document. Why
don't we pull up that image of the amateur historian? That's not my phrase. That's what the Israeli media calls him. I'm just repeating.
You call him amateur historian. I call him the Zionist Indiana Jones that didn't make it.
Yeah. Just again, I'm not the one who called him an amateur historian, but I do like your characterization better. So this person, he's been variously described not only as an amateur historian. They've called him, the Israeli media in these reports, a researcher. Sometimes they've referred to him as a civilian. His name was Ziv Erlich. He died in South Lebanon this week. And according to the media, the Israeli media, he was dressed in combat gear and armed at the time that he was engaged in a gun battle by 2 Hezbollah fighters near an archaeological site in South Lebanon. And he was accompanied by the chief of staff of the Golani Brigade, which is, reputed to be the elite brigade of the Israeli military, which, by the way, has taken such heavy losses in the last past year, and particularly the last 5 to 6 weeks in South Lebanon, that Israeli media are reporting that the military brass in Israel is alarmed. That's the word they've used to describe the reaction of the military leadership to the casualties suffered by the Golani Brigade. So apparently this chief of staff from that brigade goes in to South Lebanon with Ziv Erlich, the so-called amateur historian, and questions are swirling about what he was doing there. There are claims that he didn't have permission from the highest levels of the Israeli military to enter, which is something that apparently is required. But subsequent reporting has revealed that before he was killed in this firefight, Erlich had actually entered South Lebanon on numerous occasions. And as was explained in my interview of Max Blumenthal, as he explained, Erlich, who is a West Bank settler and has been living illegally in an illegal West Bank settlement for decades, basically was an academic fraud who went around concocting theories which justified Israel's confiscation of land on which others had inhabited for centuries, claiming that it was, in fact, historically the land of Israel. And apparently this is the mission that he was on in South Lebanon. He was allowed in to concoct, to fabricate a narrative based upon sketchy or non-existent historical evidence that South Lebanon actually was part of historical northern Israel. And so you can imagine that this man being taken out by a Hezbollah fighter is something which, whether you agree or not, whatever you may think of this individual, I imagine that was something which brought significant satisfaction to the fighters in the south of Lebanon, who have no intention whatsoever of surrendering 1 inch of this land to Israel. And this brings us to the subject of Amos Hochstein, who is the U.S. envoy to Lebanon. Maybe you could pull up the image of the report on Hochstein's efforts to negotiate a ceasefire in Lebanon. And Hochstein, if you don't know that character, he was, although he is technically a representative of the United States government in negotiations between Israel, and the Lebanese government, he is an Israeli dual citizen and served in the Israeli military. And Hochstein and the Israeli press and Western media outlets are reporting, as we heard so many times during the course of the past year in regard to Gaza, that they are on the brink of a ceasefire deal involving Lebanon. This is no more credible than were those countless reports we got over the course of the last year that the Israelis and Hamas were on the brink of a ceasefire deal. The Americans and the Israelis have been very clear that in order for there to be a ceasefire, Hezbollah would have to leave South Lebanon. It would have to go north of the Litani River. South Lebanon would then be occupied by either the Lebanese army or by foreign troops, some of whom would come from Western nations. And Israel would have the freedom to re-enter South Lebanon militarily if it deemed it in its interest to do so for the sake of its security. I can tell you, and by the way, none of this would be accompanied by a ceasefire in Gaza. And I can tell you, after having traveled to South Lebanon 4 times in the past year and spoken to dozens of people in the region, that there is zero hope of any ceasefire being negotiated on that basis. Hezbollah is not going to leave South Lebanon. It is not going to allow any foreign militaries, and particularly any Western military, to occupy South Lebanon, even temporarily. It is not going to stop striking Israel while the genocide in Gaza continues. This is an absolute pipe dream, and we are being misled yet again. The U.S. government is posturing as a mediator in a peace process when in fact it is a perpetrator of crimes against humanity. It is on the Israeli side. It's not some independent party, a party that's independent of the belligerents. It is on the Israeli side. It's enabling the Israeli government and military to destroy Lebanon. So this is a fraud, and I assure you there will be no ceasefire on that basis. And just to drive the point home, today the Israeli media reported that Hezbollah fired an unusually large number of rockets into Israel this morning. I believe the number was in excess of 200 just in the morning alone. It might have been in the range of 250 rockets, which one of the biggest salvos or collections of salvos of rockets at any point during the past year from the Islamic resistance. So I think we can say with some confidence that the Islamic resistance does not view these negotiations in the same way as Israel and the West. And just one other thing I want to say, Rami, before I invite you to chime in. The fact of the matter is that the only way to bring this to an end, the fighting in South Lebanon, is to stop the genocide in Gaza. And it is completely within the power of the US government to do that. And there's simply no excuse, no justification whatsoever for trying to do an end around the resistance groups who are trying to bring it to an end by stopping the hostilities in South Lebanon while the killing is continuing in Gaza.
Dimitri, when the Abraham Accords were coming out, Israel went on a rant about how, there was this claim about we thought that we had to have peace with the Palestinians in order to have peace with the rest of the Arab world, and instead we discovered that we had to have peace with the Arabs in order to force peace onto the Palestinians. So Israel always had the goal of isolating the Palestinians and removing any remote form of leverage that we would have had over them, right? Which was recognition from neighboring Arab states. So Israel believes that by isolating the Palestinians, we will suffocate and be forced to agree to one of their nonsense deals where we'd be selling away our rights. And Arabs throughout the Middle East or all over the region refuse to isolate the Palestinians, actually do not see themselves any different than the Palestinians. And in some way, we could also argue that the Middle East themselves are occupied, and that when they're resisting against Israel, whether it is in Yemen or Iraq or basically they're demonstrating their solidarity and the shared struggle that we have against Zionism. So I do think that these militias understand that by compromising and by agreeing to a ceasefire that doesn't include a ceasefire in Palestine, they would be doing a disservice to the Palestinians, and basically it would be an act of normalization. Every statement by the Houthis and Hezbollah, whenever they come out with statements, it always ends with, we will stop the day there's a permanent solution to the situation in Gaza, basically a ceasefire in Gaza and an end of the blockade. Mm-hmm. So when Amos Hochstein is coming up with these claims of trying to find a ceasefire settlement in Beirut, in Gaza, in Lebanon, what he's basically telling us is that this ceasefire will come at the detriment and the expense of the people of Gaza. And he's reinforcing the fact that actually the United States is not serious about ending the war in Gaza. It's more about pushing Israeli ambitions in the region instead, which is finding a reasonable way of living with Hezbollah, which would mean having them above the Litani River, of opening the Red Sea, and all that nonsense.
Right.
But the only thing that I could understand with like these types of statements, because we know we're not going to get the ceasefire out of this in Lebanon, mm-hmm. is that you call Blinken the lawyer of Netanyahu, but that goes across every single U.S. actor that is basically doing Israel's work. Amos Hochstein is doing Israel's work and keeping Lebanon and trying to make Lebanon tamed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's.
Yeah. And they don't just want, by the way, Hezbollah north of the Litani River so that they can return those 100,000 or so settlers to northern Israel who have been effectively expelled from the area. They want the water. They want the water from the Litani River. So this is very much about resources. It's not simply about security. And I think Hezbollah understands that perfectly well. And if the Lebanese military is foolish enough to try to disarm Hezbollah forcibly, that is going to plunge the country into a civil war in which the Lebanese army will be destroyed, because it does not have the the sophistication, the weaponry, the training that the Islamic resistance fighters have. So let us hope that the country of Lebanon remains reasonably unified in this extraordinarily difficult time and prevails upon the United States to stop arming Israel. So with that, Rami, I think we've gone through all the items we want to discuss in our agenda. We have some time for Q&A.
So I put up a little statement on here. I think you guys can see on the screen. It says you can start sending us questions. I'll start looking through them. And while the questions keep coming in, Dimitri, I just wanted to talk about also the whole case of sending this archaeologist to South Lebanon to find some coin or artifact that links south of Lebanon to Israel. Is that at the end of the day, I think Israel is at a race of claiming all sorts of historic facts in the region, because if they were to discover that the Lebanese people in some way are, so it's just hard to multitask, taking other questions at the same time as talking, but we are the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Syrians in the region. We are the descendants of our ancestors who lived on this land for thousands of years. We are not settlers that came from the Arabian Gulf. So Israel is at a race to claim these artifacts before we do so, because it is our history. It is our shared history of this region that connects us to this land. We are people that were Arabized, Canaanites, Philistines, Phoenicians. We are part of this region, and they're trying to delegitimize us by claiming that they are these lost tribes that were sent to Europe or whatever of the sort. Yes. Mm-hmm. So we have a first question here that says, how do you think Iran is now placed in all of this? I'm assuming Fiona is referring to the possibility of negotiations happening for a ceasefire in Lebanon.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, Fiona. I actually saw somebody I watch regularly, George Galloway, interviewing retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas McGregor. This was in the last 24 hours or so. And George said that according to his sources, I'm in no position to, assess the credibility or of his sources, but George, I think, is a very trustworthy source himself. The Iranians are on the verge of launching the retaliatory attack against Israel. And in fact, he said it could very well happen within the next 24 hours. I'm in no position to comment upon the veracity of that report, but I will offer my view that there is a retaliation coming. I can't believe that the Iranians, after having said they would retaliate, having warned Israel on multiple occasions, and having watched how the situation has just continued to escalate, Israel is now mass murdering medics in Lebanon. In one strike, they killed 15 Lebanese medics. I think it was yesterday or the day before. So they're taking their genocidal tactics from Gaza, transferring them to Lebanon. If anything, Iran has an even greater incentive now to strike than it did back, I think, on October 1st or so, when it was, or mid-October, when it was struck by Israel. So that is an escalation, I think, that is almost certainly going to occur. So we have two wars escalating potentially towards a nuclear exchange in two parts of the world. I can hardly imagine a more dangerous situation than this.
To the folks on this live, I just want to say that we read the comments on the videos once they're published as well. And there was a question that was posted by Helen McKerney from our last live stream, which said, can someone please explain to me why the Ukrainians shouldn't fight and resist Russia? I've been an active supporter of the Palestinians for a decade, and I noticed that many of you who also support Palestine also seem to not support Ukraine. And why that makes people hard right, or however you described it. No shade, please. I'm done with that. This question really, I think this question comes in good faith, that some people could be curious to know about, well, what is the difference between the Palestinians and Ukrainians? Why, Dimitri, do we support the right to self-determination and the resistance of the Palestinian people? Yet in Ukraine, there is a little discrepancy here. And why does that make the people that do support Ukraine right-wing, or I forgot what was the other word she used to describe them? But anyways, what do you have to say about this, Dimitri?
Well, speaking for myself, I've never taken the position that the Ukrainian people don't have a right to defend their territory. They do have a right. They have a legal right and they have a moral right to do it. The question is this a situation in which they should exercise that right? And I say no. And it's certainly not a situation in which we should be arming them to the teeth so that they do exercise that right and inflict maximum damage on Russia. So why do I say that? Number one, because they can't win. It's impossible. They are not going to win. Russia has a population that is 4 to 5 times as large at this stage. Russia has vast energy resources. Russia has a much larger body of modern weaponry. It has hypersonic missiles, which no Western country has. It has repeatedly fought devastating ground wars in this very part of the world, in Ukraine, and it has consistently emerged victorious. And we have been predicting, those of us who are critics of the NATO proxy war, that Ukraine would lose. And in fact, that's precisely what is happening. Even the Western media are now acknowledging, even Western leaders, some of them are reluctantly acknowledging that Ukraine's military is on the verge of collapse. So the country's energy grid has been largely destroyed. There is a negotiated solution here. I repeat, there is a negotiated solution on the table that is available that would enable the Ukrainians to maintain a sovereign state. Yes, they would have to give up a significant part of the territory that made their country, that was part of their country at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But they would still have a viable sovereign state. And if they gave up the 4 oblasts that have been annexed by Russia and Crimea, and they would still have access to the Black Sea, and they would have peace, and they could start reconstructing their country. Now let's contrast this to the Palestinians. The Palestinians have no state, and the Israelis have absolutely no intention of giving them a state. If the Israelis said to the Palestinians, you can have a state, we are going to give you a big chunk of historic Palestine, and you can have true sovereignty over that state. If I were the advisor to the Palestinians, I would say, take that deal. Take the deal, compromise. Don't demand on the restoration of every single inch of historic Palestine back to your control. It's going to cause immense suffering if you insist upon complete control over the whole of historic Palestine. You may end up getting wiped out as a people. Take the deal, compromise. That's what I would say. But that's not an option that's on the table for the Palestinians. The Israelis have taken the idea of a sovereign state completely off the table. They're not even pretending anymore to be in a peace process. And the last thing, another big difference between what is happening in Palestine and what is happening in Ukraine is who is the aggressor. And in that regard, I'm going to allow you to take it over, Rami. I'm going to invite you to comment on it. There's a whole history here about provocation, which we in the West need to bear in mind when we talk about how we should deal with this war in Ukraine.
Well, I also think that if you go, I was going to say historically, but 2014 is not that long ago, there was an American-sponsored coup that happened in Ukraine. So there's a deliberate shift, I would say, that the Americans are trying to push in Ukraine to get Ukraine part of the Western sphere of influence. And it's not about people wanting Ukraine to be part of the Western sphere of influence or the Eastern sphere of influence, but it's more about the hostilities that Ukraine are trying to do in order to provoke Russia. I was in Ukraine in February 2022, before the war started, and I went to the trade union office, which was torched to the ground, not torched to the ground, but definitely all the pro-Russian, the Russian speakers or people that support in some way that celebrate Russian culture in Odessa were protesting, were pushed into the trade union office, and neo-Nazis started torching the office building itself. And I believe there was a dozen or so Ukrainians of Russian descent that were killed. And to go a bit further than this, one of the biggest grievances of the Russian government is Ukraine trying to get a membership in NATO. Now, whether Russia has the right to let's just say, attack Ukraine for having NATO ambitions, I think any country that was bound by NATO have every single right to fight against other countries joining NATO. I'm looking at the Libyans, the Serbs, or the Palestinians that are living under the boot of NATO strength through its support of Israel, or whether it is the Pakistanis, the Afghans, the Iraqis. There is a long track record of countries that have been attacked by the West, and I think it's an insult for these types of countries that want to be part of this organization, which I like to describe NATO as an alliance of white supremacists. I was in a debate with someone in Georgia the other day, and she was telling me about, well, there's nothing wrong if countries want to join NATO. It's their own right choice. As a Palestinian, I have every single right to oppose Georgia and Ukraine wanting to be part of a white supremacist alliance that will then be used to attack other Arab countries or non-Arab countries. So you won't find sympathy from me on that angle. And then additionally, 1 month after the war in Ukraine started, we were hours away of a peace treaty or a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. Russia signed its share of the its side of the contract. Ukraine didn't, or it was about to until was it Boris Johnson? I remember who was the leader of. It was Boris Johnson. Sorry, it was changing every 2 weeks back then. With faster than lettuce expires, as they said, and basically the Ukrainians were forced to not compromise or not sign this agreement. And that just pushes me to know that the anti-war position is to get a ceasefire, is to put an end to this war. And the people that don't want the war are those back in Ukraine.
Right.
So,
sorry. One thing I want to add is, when we're talking about this conflict, another distinguishing feature is that NATO wanted to put potentially nuclear-tipped missiles into Ukraine. They would have been minutes away from the major population centers of Russia, and potentially they were going to place large military bases in eastern Ukraine. And if you look at the topography there is basically a straight, flat line from Ukraine to Moscow. And this is, again, the Russians have fought devastating wars on this land, and from their perspective, having an aggressive, gigantic military alliance with bases and potentially nuclear-tipped missiles just a few hundred kilometers from Moscow was a severe threat to their security. So that is a concern which the Russians tried to address non-violently when Putin put to Biden in late 2021 a new security treaty for Europe, which addressed those issues. And the Americans simply, not only did they not agree to a new security treaty, they refused even to have a discussion about it. So I think it's very easy for us to fall into a view of equivalency between what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Palestine. There are certainly some similarities, but there are important distinctions which I think would explain why one might say the Palestinian people should resist, but the Ukrainians should negotiate a deal and should get the best deal that they can.
And also, Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, Russia was trapped into believing, Russia believed during the Minsk I Accord at least that it had a fair partner that wanted to have peace in the region. And I think Angela Merkel came up, and I think François Hollande came up saying that the purpose of Minsk I and Minsk II agreement was to give more time to arm Ukraine. So the thing is that I think, I would agree with the person who asked this question on the previous video, if there was an honest partner for peace in the region, if Ukraine, Germany, and France were in good faith. But the problem is that there's no good faith. And the question there is, well, what do you do in that situation? And we know that the West has ambitions of expanding NATO. It said, there was an agreement with Gorbachev saying not 1 inch eastward after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're now in Ukraine. And the question is now, Georgia's trying to join NATO. So NATO, are we going to wait until NATO takes the entire world before standing up? And then by then, Russia will be possibly balkanized and China as well. So there's a vision of the world, I believe, that we cannot afford to be curious and wait and see how it will end up. But that's my position, Dimitri. There was a couple of other questions. Dimitri, can we do 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay. So there was a question over here that goes the line of, sorry, just the live chat goes quite fast. Okay, this is a question, Dimitri, by Nick, which says, do you think the Ukrainian army will last till January 2025? Oh, that's in 2 weeks. Or sorry, that's in 2 months or 1 month.
Yeah, 5 weeks.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good question, Nick. I follow the reports daily about conditions on the battlefield in both Ukraine and Lebanon and Gaza. I spend probably more time than is good for my health trying to keep up to speed on what is happening from one day to the next. And it appears to me, I'm not a military expert, that the Ukrainian military is in a state of collapse. It is now a daily occurrence that the Russian military experiences significant territorial advances and takes villages and towns all over the front line. There's a very big front line, and from the Kursk region, where the Russians are now launching, I think, their 4th counteroffensive. They've recovered approximately half the land that the Ukrainians took on a lightning blitz into Russian territory a few months ago. Nobody really understood why they were going there, because there really isn't anything there. It's just sort of open forested area with very few population centers. But they've taken back about half the land. The Ukrainian soldiers who remain in the part that hasn't been recovered by Russia are at serious risk of being surrounded and destroyed or taken prisoner. The Russians recently took the heavily fortified city of Ugledar and Vodiana, which is to the north of it, a town that was also fairly heavily fortified. They are now on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, which is a major hub in the Donbass area. In Kupiansk, they've entered the city of Kupiansk and pushed the Ukrainian forces to the Oskol River in various parts of that particular area of the front line. So wherever you look, the Ukrainian military is in retreat. They are losing cities, they are losing towns, they are losing villages. The accounts from the battlefield are that the Ukrainian military is vastly outmatched, not only in terms of military personnel, but in terms of artillery, air defense systems, fighter aircraft. The Russians effectively have complete air superiority now. So are they going to make it to January? I don't know. They might not make it to January, and especially if the weather turns very cold and the country is plunged into a deep freeze because the electricity grid cannot keep the population warm. And I suspect that the Biden administration, in fact, there have been reports to this effect, which shouldn't surprise anybody, is desperate to keep the Ukrainian military in the fight until Trump takes power, so that they can blame the Trump administration on the defeat. But I don't know, and I think that Douglas McGregor said in an interview yesterday or today that he thinks that's part of the reason, or I think it was John Mearsheimer, that he thinks that's part of the reason why they've authorized the Ukrainians to use ATACMS missiles on Russian targets deep inside Russia, because they think that will keep them in the fight until Trump takes office. But that's a dubious proposition in my view.
Folks, I think we should wrap it up, Dimitri. Everyone, thank you for joining us on this live stream. Feel free to ask us questions even after this live. We will be reading them, and if there's anything relevant for next stream, I'll make sure to bring it forward. Dimitri, there's a few things coming up this week. Do you want to share with our followers any of the good updates?
Yep. Tomorrow is as I indicated earlier on, the final day of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Montreal. I plan to, by the way, I sought media accreditation. I am a member of the Canadian Union of Freelance Journalists. I have a press card. I have been doing journalism for over 12 years. I've published hundreds of reports, even sometimes in the mainstream media. And every single time I apply for media accreditation to these government organized events, I am rejected. So I can't get into the actual facility where the parliamentarians are, but I can access parts of this gigantic complex where delegates are passing by to get into the facility. So I'm going to try to speak to some of these delegates tomorrow. I will do a report from the final day of the NATO Assembly. On Tuesday, I'm going to be interviewing Marwa Osman, an incredibly courageous Lebanese journalist who is based in Beirut and who comes from South Lebanon. And on Thursday, I'm going to be interviewing Zachary Foster, who's a Jewish American academic who has done some very important work in terms of studying the plight of the Palestinian people. And as the situation unfolds, Rami and I may have other things to report upon, including the all-important elections in Romania.
Absolutely. Folks, before we wrap it up, make sure to check our links in our YouTube video descriptions. There's a link to our Telegram that we encourage everyone to sign up to in case we get banned from YouTube. And then there's Patreon, Instagram. What else, Dimitri, can they subscribe to? Substack.
We're on LinkedIn. Actually, a lot of people watch our stuff on LinkedIn, which is interesting. But did you mention Telegram?
I did mention Telegram. Please join it. We post all of our content there. We immediately link the two together.
And we just started doing that, so yeah. It's new to us, and we're starting to build a body of work on Telegram.
Perfect, folks. So see you all next Sunday, possibly 6 p.m., maybe sooner if we decide to accommodate the Europeans.
Peace out, everybody.
Bye. Dimitri.
Yeah.
We need to wait.